Well, here we are at the end of our journey of Jewish letters. We've talked about Jews as people of the book and people of the books, where they not only created a Torah and canonized it, but then kept writing and kept talking and had a Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible, and then the canon of rabbinic literature through Jewish law and Jewish legends and liturgy, legal decisions. And we talked as well about the modern phenomenon of Jewish liturgy and how creative that has become in recent generations. We're going to talk about today is the phenomenon of modern Jewish literature, which is also an important part of that Jewish canon, that Jewish library, so to speak. And I may have mentioned in the past that when we at Kol Hadash use our Torah in the Ark for our high holiday services, we do readings both from the Torah itself and from other pieces of Jewish literature. And we'll put those other volumes into the Ark because our point is visual too. Our Ark is wider. We include both historical Torah readings and modern writings as what we consider important literature to learn from. And Jewish writing didn't stop even in the Middle Ages. But what is interesting about some of the medieval Jewish literature is that it shows hallmarks of what modern Jewish literature would become, which is an expression of Jewish culture and life beyond the boundaries of religious identity and synagogue practice. So even in the works of the rabbis, it's primarily focused on living a religious life, on obeying the divinely authored law, on how to pray. Now, these are all part of what we would consider religious life. Beginning in the Middle Ages, however, we begin to see much more Jewish, we might call it secularish literature. The authors are often rabbis, they're often pious people, but they're talking about this worldly experiences. So we'll show you just a couple of examples of this. You can get a flavor for what this would have looked like. So here are some examples of medieval Spanish Jewish poetry. There's a few by Yehuda Ahmed right at the top, we'll show you. The first is called The Apple. You have captured me with your charm, my lady. You've enslaved me brutally in our prison. From the very day that we had to part, I found no likeness to your beauty. I console myself with a rosy apple, whose scent is like the myrrh of your nose and your lips, its shape like your breast, and its color like the hue which is seen on your cheeks. Yehuda Ahmed was a rabbi in 11th century Spain. And what? He's writing about the shape of breast. And then the second one is another one of my favorites of his. My love washes her clothes in the water of my tears. Her brilliance makes them dry. Having my two eyes, she does not need well water. Her beauty contains the sun. Again, an ode to love, right? And this is very common with what you would have seen in medieval Islamic poetry, Arabic language poetry in the same time period. There's a volume of this Jewish poetry that's called Wine, Woman, and Death, because those were three of the major themes that were talked about. And we'll see the wine show up in one of the poems we'll look at in a little bit. Now, Halevi also writes conventionally religious poetry. This is a very famous one called My Heart is in the East. My heart is in the East and I in the depths of the West. My food has no taste. How can it be sweet? How can I fulfill my pledges and my vows? In the Hebrew, by the way, this is Nidarai v'asarai, which is like the beginning of Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre v'asarai, it's the same pattern of verbs. So he's alluding to that particular prayer. How can I fulfill my pledges and my vows when Zion is in the power of Edom and I in the fetters of Arabia? It would be nothing to me to leave all the goodness of Spain. So rich will it be to see the dust of the ruined sanctuary. So even to see the destroyed Zion, the destroyed temple in Jerusalem would be better than all the riches and wonderful life I have in the depths of the West, at the edge of the West in Spain, at the end of the Mediterranean, which at the time was the end of the known world. Here, again, this sounds like a very pious lament, but at the same time, he's also written these other poems about love and unrequited love, albeit, but he even has one clever poem called The Gray Hair, which says, I was looking at myself and I found a gray hair in my beard. I pulled it out and the gray hair said, you may have vanquished me, but my friends will come back and vanquish you. That's the way of life too. Yep. So here's one by Yehuda al-Harizi. And again, you'll notice some of the names. You had Yehuda Halevi, which means Judah the Levite, but here you have Judah al-Harizi, which sounds like an Arabic name, or even Solomon ibn Gabirol, using the Arabic son of instead of Ben, which is the more conventional Hebrew version. So Shem Tov ben Palakera, for example, is the more conventional Hebrew formula, but you see that they begin to adopt Arabic patronymic forms as well. So we have a secret kept where the girl brought me into the house of love. She was as pure and perfect as Abigail. When she took off her veil, she revealed a form that put to shame the beauty of Esther. So you notice they're comparing modern beauties to biblical characters. Abigail is one of David's wives. Esther, obviously, from the story of Purim. Her light shone in the darkness, made everything tremble. The hills started to dance like rams. I thought, our secrets are discovered. But she stretched out her hand like a woman of strength, like a woman of valor, that passage in Proverbs, and enveloped me with her jet black hair. The day was immediately turned into night. And the 1940s movie fades to black, right? Because they couldn't show what happened next. There's also some ego involved here. Self-praise. I am the master and song is my slave. I am an instrument for all practitioners. My poems are like a monarch's diadem and crowns for the heads of all his ministers. I am no more than 16 years of age, yet as clever as a sage of 80 years. So here you have original creation, a little bit of ego involved, sort of bragging, which again was a staple of court poetry at the time, where the poets would laud themselves, but be clever by doing so. If fear is like a rock, then I am a hammer. If sorrow is a fire, then I am the sea. When it comes, my heart increases its strength, like the moon that shines brighter when the darkness falls. So again, a motivation for courage and action. Very different from a sort of pious, God save me, God help me. These are people emphasizing what people can do. And then finally, by Shmuel HaNagid, an invitation. My friend, tell me, when shall I pour you my wine? The cry of the cock woke me and sleep has deserted my eyes. Come out and see the morning light like a scarlet thread in the east. Make haste, give me a cup before the dawn starts to rise, of spiced pomegranate juice from the perfumed hand of a girl who will sing songs, my soul revives, and then die. So he wakes up hungover. He has another drink. He's remembering this great night. He then passes out again or falls asleep again at the end. So again, this is not what you would expect to find in Hebrew poetry from the Middle Ages. But this is reflecting a renewed emphasis on this life, on these experiences, and an openness to creating in the holy language, in Hebrew, even though one is committed to a religious lifestyle, there's space for something else that's possible. And that's the kind of opening that we'll see expanding even more so in the modern period. Yes. Yes, those poems were written in Hebrew. There's other literature written in Ladino, folk songs, things like that. But no, this was written in Hebrew, and part of the Hebrew writing was done as a competition with Arabic, because these Jews were living in a multilingual environment. And remember, they're also living under the Arabs for many centuries before they're living directly under Spanish rule. That's the Reconquista period, which is later in the Middle Ages. But in the earlier period of the Middle Ages, they're living under Arabic rule, and so that's their primary language of dialogue. They're studying Arabic language philosophy. Maimonides is very well versed in Arabic philosophy, as just one example. And obviously Neo-Hellenistic philosophy through Arabic translation. And the poetry as well becomes a sort of linguistic competition between the two. And it's later in that Reconquista period where Jews are living under Christian rule, they begin to speak Ladino, or the kind of medieval Spanish, sometimes also called Judesmo. And that becomes even more important after they're exiled from Spain and they maintain that language. Just like Yiddish stays medieval German, even though they move east into Poland and Ukraine and Russia, so too with Ladino, it stays with them as they move. But this medieval Spanish Hebrew poetry is a really interesting episode where they're beginning to reclaim the holy language for more secular purposes. Now, when we get to the modern period, we talk more about the history transition in our history class, but there are a lot of differences for Jewish literature being written in the modern period. For one thing, your audience is different. In the past, the audience for these poems would have been the elites, who could read it, who could get the allusions. They would sometimes put acrostics with their names hidden in the first line of each word. I mean, they were very creative with it, but it was to a very learned audience. When you're writing modern Jewish literature, Dara Horn or Jonathan Safran Foer does not want to sell 1,000 copies of their book. They want to sell hundreds of thousands of copies of their book. So they're not writing with an impenetrable text that only an elite audience can understand. They're going to write for a mass audience. And so one of the forms of Jewish literature that really took off in the 19th and 20th century was actually Yiddish literature.
more so than a renewed Hebrew literature. The early Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment, wanted to go back to the classical languages, so they started writing these Hebrew novels. But a very limited audience could read and understand Hebrew. It was educated men, and not all men were educated enough to read modern Hebrew. They could recite the prayer book. They knew how to pronounce the letters, but they didn't know how to understand it as a creative language. Now, Yiddish they spoke every day in Eastern Europe. And once you can read the Hebrew letters, and you already speak Yiddish, you can read Yiddish literature. So Yiddish literature was actually much more popular than this early modern Hebrew literature in the 19th century because the masses could read it. There were Hebrew language Jewish newspapers, and there were Yiddish language Jewish newspapers, but the Yiddish language ones did much better because people could read and understand it. And a lot of the writers actually, just like Charles Dickens, would write in serial form, a chapter or two in each issue of the paper. They did that for Yiddish novels as well. Tabby the Milkman, we think of this Fiddler on the Roof as a full body of stories, but it was several sections written over several years. Beginning, I think, in the 1890s, ending in the 19-teens. So it was a long range there of those stories coming to full development. So the languages made the audience made a big difference, and the languages, as I alluded to, also are a big difference. Plus, once Jews become assimilated to the surrounding environment, they might write in English, or in German, or in French. Now their audience is potentially even bigger, but also it begins to raise the question, where do you shelve this book? Does this book belong in American literature, or does it belong in Jewish literature? Or is it German or French, or is it Jewish? Like, where do you fit it? And in the card catalog era, that was very important, because you had one card, and then all the other cards said, see this card. In the hyperlink era of websites, you've got to have a URL, but everything else can link to it from everywhere else, and the original source makes, where you categorize it makes it a little bit less different. The format of writing was very different. First of all, mass newspapers was a new phenomenon. They didn't have that in the Middle Ages because you didn't have mass literacy in the Middle Ages. But also the idea of a Jewish novel being printed was novel. It was new. That was a new form for Jewish literature. Poetry had been around, as we saw, generally in a pious format, although this medieval period is somewhat different. But again, the idea of a mass market for that is unusual. And as I mentioned, Jews assimilating to the outside world and writing their books in non-Jewish language, that also means they can read non-Jewish languages, and they might be influenced by the novels of Balzac or Victor Hugo and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. They're reading European literature if they're in Europe, and so they are influenced by that naturally. In fact, there was a huge market for Yiddish translations of European literature. Because Jews wanted to understand the literature of the world. And there's a very funny episode that took place in New York in the New York Yiddish Theater, which is sort of the precursor to Broadway in many ways, where they did a production of the Yiddish King Lear. And it's a perfect, Yiddish play because complaining about a thankless child, that could have been taken out of, any Borscht Belt comedian's routine about you never call, you never write, sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. But the funny part is, at the end of the play, the audience was so impressed by it, they called out, "Author, author!" Well, Shakespeare didn't make an appearance. But the translation was what was important, and so that they could experience world literature.
Shakespeare has been translated into Swahili.
I believe it. I believe it. So the point is that as you are reading this out of literature, it's going to influence what you're creating in Jewish context too. So you might not only make allusions to Esther or Abigail, but you might refer to Helen of Troy or other kind of references that the rabbis wouldn't have referred to, or that medieval rabbis wouldn't have referred to. The subjects that you focus on may change as well. You might write a book about a Jewish military hero that you might not have written in a previous period. Certainly if you're motivated by the Zionist movement and the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in Israel and fighting back against fate, then the idea of a Maccabee character might be very attractive to you, where you might not have chosen that in previous generations. So we're going to look at a few examples of this modern literature. Some of them are in our volume, Judaism in a Secular Age, which is one of the assigned course books for this class as a whole, for the 3-year cycle. We look at it more in the philosophy year, but we do look at some of the literature elements
in this year, and those are detailed in the readings, but we'll take a look at some examples now and have a few other examples of modern poets as well. And I will just say that we don't have time to get into them, but there are a number of novelists as well who would qualify for this. If you go back 50 years, you would have talked about Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow and Cynthia Ozick and other story writers like that. And actually, you might have even talked about Henry Roth, who is lesser known than Philip Roth, but wrote a fantastic novel in the 30s called Call It Sleep, which is really very good. It has a sort of James Joyce stream of consciousness edge to it. He wrote it in the 30s, and people, it just sank like a stone. Nobody noticed it, and then it was rediscovered in the 60s with this episode of American Jewish literature with Philip Roth and Bellow and Malamud and Ozick to some extent. It became more aware. But in the modern era, we have writers like Nathan Englander, who's done both short stories and novels, Jonathan Safran Foer, who's done a number of novels, Nicole Krauss, Dara Horn, who are also writing really interesting books. And they're meditating on this experience of what it means to be Jewish in the modern world in their own time period. Although sometimes they do it in very interesting ways. Dara Horn, for example, wrote, I found a really fascinating book that's set in sort of 3 time periods. It's called Guide for the Perplexed. And the earliest time period is Maimonides himself, who wrote a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. And it's about his life as the court physician and what he was doing there. Then it also goes back to the early 1900s when the Cairo Geniza is first discovered by 2 English women who have an academic background, and Solomon Schechter, who at the time wasn't the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He was a professor at Cambridge University. And how they rediscovered the Geniza and all those fragments from all those centuries back, including to the time of Maimonides. And then it fast forwards again to the early 21st century, where a woman has invented a program she calls Geniza, which collects every recording and every picture of every moment of your life and categorizes it. So it's recording everything you're saying, it's taking pictures of a live video of everything you're doing, and it's filing it away so you don't have to forget anything. And that yeesh response comes to play in the novel too. But anyways, but she's meditating. What does it mean to be living in the 21st century, but wanting to save these things? But if we took the Geniza impulse and put it in modern times, what would it look like? So, anyways, it's very creative stuff. Nicole Krauss is a beautiful writer. There are lists of like top Jewish writers, top Jewish novelists even today, and all of them, they make their novels Jewish by making their characters Jewish. So that sort of flags it for you when this character is grappling with, should I say the Kaddish or not? Or do I break keeping the kosher laws or not? Nathan Englander has a very funny short story called Reb Kringle about an Orthodox rabbi who makes a living in December by playing Santa Claus at a department store because he's got the white beard and the round belly and whatever. And he's like, he grumbles about it. He doesn't want to do it. And his wife says, it's good money. And you're just, you're entertaining the Goyish kids, and who cares? What's the big deal? But then one year, a kid is put down in his lap, and he says, what do you want for Christmas? And the kid says, I want a menorah. He says, a menorah? What? And the kid says, well, my parents got divorced, and my new stepdad says I can't have a menorah in our house this year. We have to have only a Christmas tree. Whose child is this that's being denied the menorah? Of course, he's fired. You can't do that when you're Santa. But it's a really creative story about how we draw lines and what we do. There's another beautiful one in Englander's. What we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank is the name of the volume, but it's the cover story, or the title of the story. And in that, they play the Anne Frank game, where they. In this case, they get high, so they're free to talk, and they imagine which of their neighbors might hide them if another Holocaust happened, and would they really be willing to do it or not? And would you betray me? And how loyal are we to each other? But it really takes an interesting turn. Anyway, so they're creating very creative settings to meditate on the legacy of the Holocaust, the settings that we're in now, what it means to be Jewish. So modern Jewish literature is in many ways working out these questions of Jewish identity through character, through plot, through creative narrative, rather than explicit theology or philosophical argument. But they're still making very similar and interesting points. There's a beautiful scene in Jonathan Safran Foer's novel Here I Am at a funeral. And the rabbi at the funeral gives a fantastic, a fantastic funeral eulogy. This is a novelist just writing what he thinks they might say in that setting. So we're going to take a look at some examples going back to the early 20th century and forward from there. Okay, so this is from our volume Judaism in the Secular Age. And the first one we'll look at is a short story called The Pious Cat by Yehuda Ahmed Peretz. Peretz is writing in Eastern Europe, Warsaw mostly, and he comes out of an Orthodox background. So you'll see how he's sort of parodying the Orthodox background by talking about a pious cat. We're just going to sort of skim through this story. One after another, the 3 canaries had been brought into the house. One after another, the cat had taken care of them. Now, this cat, it must be kept in mind, is no common alley serenader, but a truly devout soul, model of piety, one who wears his white garment at all times, not only on holidays. There's a tradition of wearing a special white garment for Yom Kippur or for Passover. It's also what you're buried in. It's a white cat, right? But he's sort of playing on that idea that the white is pure, but we'll see this cat is not so nice. Such piety, only the most devout anxious they are for any excuse to pronounce a blessing would, as he does, wash themselves 10 times a day, right? So a pious person would brush before they wash, so the fact that the cat washes himself 10 times a day means he must be a very pious cat. Such refinement. He eats his meals quietly and unobtrusively, out of the way. His regimen is limited to dairy dishes during the day. Only toward nightfall does he permit himself meat, kosher mouth meat. Nor does he set to like an uncouth creature and devour the evening meal like a glutton. He proceeds daintily, gently, let the mouse live another moment, and another, let it dance across, tremble a little, confess its skins. The pious cat does not rush things. So, I mean, this is presenting the cat's cruelty as being pious, but, you know, that's part of the point here, that maybe the people who are pious are the ones who are cruel. When the first canary was brought to the house, the cat's pity was aroused immediately. Alas, he thought, do you think such a beautiful, gorgeous little bird, a delightful little creature, would have no share in the next world? That the bird could not possibly have a share in the next world, of that the cat was certain. Its manner of washing was a nonconformist. It must be kept in a cage, therefore it must be a wild animal. When one takes into consideration the singing itself, the wanton manner, the warbling and whistling, well, this is clearly an opening to the sinful world. Was there ever a cat confined in a cage? Or a cat that whistled so boisterously and brazenly? A shame, a shanda, a scandal. The pious cat's generous heart bled for the poor bird. In spite of everything, it's still a living creature. And the whole tragedy is that the sinful body is so lovely and pleasing. The evil temptation is so powerful. How can such a sweet and tiny frail bird stand up against such an evil temptation? The longer it lives, the more it sins. I must save it from its sins. And so feathers flew in the house. The cat was soundly thrashed. It, accepting the beating meekly, groaned piously, meowed out a caterwauling atonement. No more, he vowed, would he sin. Again, this is the pious person who suffers and then accepts the blame. No fool, the cat understood why he got the beating. He was spanked because he had scattered feathers over the house and sprinkled the tablecloth with blood. Such sentences must be executed quietly, carefully, and devoutly, without a single feather misplaced, and so he strangled it. Now he's beaten again. Now he realized the penalty is not that we must, not about how he killed, but that we must not kill. We must love, we must forgive, and improve the sinful world, win the sinners away. He approached the third canary. Don't worry, he said, though you are black with sin, I will do you no harm. I won't open your cage. You're silent. I will help you quiver. From the bottom of my soul, I breathe upon you sweetness and silence. You can imagine what the bird feels like with this cat, like right next to him, breathing on him. And of course, the canary could not live in the feline atmosphere. He could not draw breath, and the air suffocated. So you see how he's taking this image of the cat pursuing the bird, but he's presenting the cat as this pious creature that suffocates you, that uses whatever rationale it wants to take advantage of you, and in the end consumes you. So this is a story that only someone who had left a religious environment and maybe had some hostility to it would have included. Another great story in this collection is by Shalom Aleichem, who is actually Shalom Rabinowitz, but he went by the Yiddish sort of greeting, Shalom Aleichem. It's called the Yom Kippur Scandal. And so what the man describes here is a theft that took place on Yom Kippur of all places. So our town, Kraslivke, which is nowhere, I mean, it's just a miscellaneous place, is a small town and a poor one, and again, you have all these asides about what Jews are like or not like. He's sort of meandering as people would tell a story. So one Yom Kippur evening, a stranger arrived, and he left his bag at the inn and went right to the synagogue. He found a trustee around the collection plate, and he says, I'm from Lithuania, which means from far away. And what's your name? But you've come to pray. What can I do? Well, I'll make 3 silver rubles. He makes a gift into the plate. He gives a ruble to the cantor, a ruble to the rabbi, and one for the cheder. And so everybody is impressed by his generosity. They find a place from on the Eastern Wall, the prestigious location. So now again, this is a frame story. The man is telling the story, but we're listening to him tell the story to the audience. He goes to the place of honor. He puts on his tallis. He starts to pray. He never leaves his place all evening long or the next day. When it's finally all over, the last blast of the shofar is gone. The Day of Atonement has ended. All of a sudden, he screams, and he faints. He told us that he had brought to this town 1,800 rubles. He couldn't leave it at the inn, and he couldn't keep it in his pocket in Yom Kippur. So he took the money to the synagogue and put it into his praying stand. Well, now we know why he didn't stop praying, because he was guarding the money. And he says, it's not even my own money, it's my employer's money, and they're going to kill me. So the rabbi says, lock the door. How could this sin have happened of somebody stealing money? Stealing and carrying money on Yom Kippur. I mean, this is terrible. So he turns to the congregation. He says, listen to my friends, an ugly thing that has never happened since the world was created. On this holiest day of the year, maybe when the shofar was being blown, marking the closing of the book of life, that somebody was stolen. So everyone here must turn out their pockets, starting with me. And they search the rabbi's pockets, and they search the shaman's pockets, and the cantor's pockets. Until finally, Lazar Yosel says, what do you want to search me for? I'm not the kind of person that would do this. And then there's an aside about who Lazar Yosel was, and his kind of personality, whatever. And so finally, he is searched. He begged them not to do it. They finally shake out his pockets. And you know what they find in his pockets? A couple of well-gnawed chicken bones and a few dozen plum pits, moist from chewing. Yom Kippur is a fast day, right? You're not allowed to eat. Can you imagine what shame this produced? The story was over. The man turned back to the window and resumed smoking. Well, we asked in one voice, what about the money? What money? The man said. What do you mean, what money? The 1,800 rubles. Oh, he drawled. The 1,800 were gone. Gone? Gone forever. And that's the end of the story. You don't get to know. You're just left hanging like that. And you'll find that occasionally in Shalom Aleichem stories where the end of the story leaves you hanging. But again, if you're writing a serial story, you might want to do that. At the end of one of the Tevye stories, after his daughter has married out, this is the third daughter, and in the book version, she converts out to marry. It's not made explicit in the movie version, but in that period, there was no civil marriage. If you wanted to marry someone not Jewish, you converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, and that's how it happened. So he says, that's a heartache. Life is full of suffering, but let's think about something more cheerful. Have you heard about the plague in Odessa? That's the end of the story. Is sort of a shift gears. So you get this feeling also of the kind of Jews are in a difficult position sometimes. There's Jewish suffering going on, right? This is not a world of happy-go-lucky bourgeois challenges that the Jews in Eastern Europe were living through. And the same is true for early pioneers in the land of Israel as well. So we'll take a look at a couple of those too. This is a poet, Rachel, who was part of the earliest waves of immigration. But you can hear in this poem an expression of a very humanistic sentiment. Here on earth, not in high clouds, on this mother earth that is close, to sorrow in her sadness, to exult in her meager joy that knows so well how to console. Not nebulous tomorrow, but today, solid, warm, mighty, today materialized in the hand of this single short day to drink deep here in our own land. Before night falls, come, oh, come all, a unifying stubborn effort awake with 1,000 arms. Is it impossible to roll the stone from the mouth of the well? So here we have an affirmation of do it here, not up and above, and on this land, and today, not tomorrow, not the world to come, and work together, and we can do just about anything. What's she alluding to at the end of that poem? To roll the stone from the mouth of the well. Remember how Jacob meets Rachel in Genesis? He's traveled to a far-off land. Esau wants to kill him, and he goes to this well, which is covered with a big rock. And the shepherds would come together, and together they would roll the rock off the well. But Rachel, his relative, shows up, and she's so beautiful that he himself pushes the rock off the well. Well, remember the name of the poet, Rachel. So she's drawing on that legacy of the illusion here of the stone on the mouth of the well that's connected to her name. But any reader of her poem would be very familiar with the biblical story and would get that reference. It'd be like if I said in an English context, a rose by any other name, ... You don't have to fill in the rest of it. But this is writing in a very different vein than the traditional literature, focused on human action here and now. Or another example is Chernikovsky, who is also an early poet in the Yishuv into the early state period. And he writes this poem called Ani Ma'amin, I Believe, which is an allusion to a Maimonides liturgical piece that says, I believe with perfect faith in all these traditional things. But here he says, I believe in people, or a man, and I still believe in you. My soul still yearns for freedom, unbartered to the calf of gold. I still believe in mankind and its spirit strong and bold. So again, alluding to the golden calf, that's a biblical reference, obviously. This is a song, by the way, that we sing in our congregation. Laugh at all my dreams, my dearest, laugh and I repeat anew that I still believe in people as I still believe in you. Just an altered translation. And we sing it in Hebrew as well, and it's actually a very popular Israeli song. It even appears on some currency in Israel, a line from that song. So this is, again, a very humanistic statement. And the fact that he titles it, I Believe, the same phrasing Maimonides used, is clearly an intertextual dialogue with that source. One other example is the more contemporary poet Yehuda Ahmed, who wrote into the 2000s. I believe he died in 2000 itself. He has some marvelous pieces that, again, speak of a humanistic sentiment. When my head got banged on the door, I screamed, my head, and I screamed, door, door. I did not scream mother and not God, nor did I speak of the vision of the end of days, of a world where there will be no heads and doors anymore. When you stroked my head, I whispered, my head, and I whispered, your hand, your hand. And I did not whisper mother and not God, and I did not see wonderful visions of hands stroking heads in the opening heavens. Wherever I scream and speak and whisper is to comfort myself. My head, door, door, your hand, your hand. The individual human experience, the harsh reality of the world in the door, and the comfort we get from other people in your hand. And in the Hebrew, you actually see the gendering, because your hand is feminine. It's a feminine your hand, so it's the man and his lover, and the comfort he gets from her. And again, you see the focus on not just looking in the past and not looking to God and not looking above and beyond this world, but experiencing this world as it is. We're going to jump forward because time is short as always. I feel good in my trousers. If the Romans hadn't glorified their victory with the Arch of Titus, we wouldn't know the shape of the menorah from the temple. But we know the shape of Jews because they multiplied into me. I feel good in my trousers in which my victory is hidden. Even though I know I'll die, and even though I know the Messiah won't come, I feel good. I'm made from remnants of flesh and blood and leftovers of philosophies. I'm the generation of the pot bottom. Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I hear this hard spoon scratching and scraping the bottom of the pot. But I feel good in my trousers. I feel good. What do you think he means by saying, I feel good in my trousers in which my victory is hidden? Is it the winning lottery ticket in the pocket? His progeny, his fertility, it's the continuity of life, right? And that's the point, is that the Jews of the past multiplied into me, and my victory against the ravages of time is that I'm part of this eternal people that will live on after me through natural reproduction. And also the fact that I'm incomplete, but it's okay. I'm the generation of remnants of flesh and blood and leftovers of philosophy. That's okay. I can patch myself together. He has another poem called I Want to Confuse the Bible. where he says, I want to mix everything up and do it all backwards, and Cain and Abel are good friends, and Sodom and Gomorrah are booming towns, and let's just do it all backwards and invert it. And he also has another one where he wants to make a cut and paste Bible, so he takes the good stuff he likes and pastes it all together. Again, he's coming from a traditional background. You can hear this on Sabbath Lie. On Friday at the twilight of a summer's day, while the smells of food and prayer rose from every house and the sound of the Sabbath angel's wings was in the air, while I was still a child, I started to lie to my father. I went to another synagogue. So his dad says, I didn't see you at davening today. And he says, well, I went to another synagogue. I don't know if he believed me or not, but the taste of the lie was good and sweet on my tongue. And in all the houses that night, hymns rose up along with lies to celebrate the Sabbath. And in all the houses that night, the Sabbath angels died like flies in a lamp, and lovers put mouth to mouth, blew each other up until they floated upward or burst. And since then, the lie has been good and sweet in my tongue. And since then, I always go to another synagogue. And my father returned the lie when he died. I've gone to another life. So he doesn't believe in that ideology of the afterlife anymore, but there's still a continuity of a connection and disconnection from his past. The God he grapples with is a Jewish God, even if he may not believe in it anymore. So these are a few examples of maybe an earlier generation of poetry. I did also want to show you one example of post-Holocaust poetry, because you can imagine that the Holocaust experience would have been a profound impact in Jewish history and on the creation of Jewish culture. So this is a poem called Dead Men Don't Praise God by Jacob Gladstein. We received the Torah on Sinai, and in Majdanek, the death camp, we gave it back. Dead men don't praise God, and the Torah was given to the living. And just as we all stood together at the giving of the Torah, so did we all die together at Majdanek. I'll translate the tousled head, the pure eyes, the tremulous mouth of a Jewish child into this frightful fairy tale. I'll fill the sky with stars, and I'll tell him, our people is a fiery sun from beginning to beginning to beginning. Learn this, my little one, from beginning to beginning to beginning. Our whole imagined people stood at Mount Sinai and received the Torah. The dead, the living, the unborn, every soul among us answered, we will obey and hear. You, the saddest boy of all generations, you also stood at Mount Sinai. Your nostrils caught the raisin almond fragrance of each word of the Torah. It was Shavuot, the green holiday. You sang with him like a songbird. I will hear and obey, obey and hear, from beginning to beginning to beginning. So this is based on the rabbinic ideology that all the Jewish people, even those who were not yet born, were still there to receive the Torah and accept the covenant. I love this line, from beginning to beginning to beginning. Maybe he's emphasizing that this is the end, but maybe he's also saying this is like the beginning of those Torah scroll readings. Every Simchat Torah, you roll it back and you read it again, and you read it again, and it always begins with, in the beginning, every time you go back to that first verse in Genesis. Little one, your life is carved in the constellations of our sky. You were never absent. You could never be missing. When we were, you were, and when we vanished, you vanished with us. And just as we all stood together at the giving of the Torah, so did we all die together at Majdanek. From all sides, the souls came flocking, the souls of those who had lived out their lives, of those who had died young, of those tortured and tested in every fire, of those who were not yet born. Of all the dead Jews from great-grandfather Abraham down, they all came to Majdanek for the great slaughter. It's like an anti-Sinai, right? It's the place of national birth and the locus of national death. All those who stood at Mount Sinai and received the Torah took those holy deaths upon themselves. We want to perish with our whole people. We want to be dead again, the ancient souls cried out. Mama Sarah, Mother Rachel, Miriam and Deborah the prophetess went down singing prayers and songs. Even Moses, who so much did not want to die when his time came. There's a whole midrash about Moses arguing for more life. He now died again. And his brother Aaron and King David and the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, and famous rabbis, Maharam and Marshal, and with every holy soul that perished in torture, hundreds of souls of Jews long dead died with them. It's like their memories died, right? The culture died. It wasn't just the individuals. And you, beloved boy, you were there too, carved against the constellated sky. You were there and you died there. Sweet as a dove, you stretched out your neck like an Isaac waiting to be sacrificed, and sang together with the mothers and fathers from beginning to beginning to beginning. Remember how the Baal Shem rocked you in his arms when your whole imagined people vanished in the gas chambers of Majdanek. And above the gas chambers and the holy dead souls, a forsaken, abandoned Mount Sinai veiled itself in smoke. Remember, when God shows up, there's smoke, there's a cloud, so you can't see God, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. But this is an abandoned Mount Sinai. It's silent, it's deaf, it's mute. Little boy with the tousled head, pure eyes, and tremulous mouth. That was you then, the tiny, quiet, forlorn, given back Torah. You stood on top of Mount Sinai and cried. You cried your cry to a dead world from beginning to beginning to beginning. This was your cry. You received the Torah on Sinai, and in Maidanic we gave it back. Dead men don't praise God. The Torah was given to the living. And so if you killed us, God, we give it back. Right? I mean, there's such loss and pain and grappling there and anger, and still a dialogue with tradition. I mean, he knows all these names and these characters and the stories behind them. That's all part of who he is, but it's that complex legacy of what do you do with the God who allows this to happen? So the same kind of stuff you'll see in theology and in writing. You see in Elie Wiesel's Night, in his memoir. You'll see in Holocaust poetry by Gladstein and Nellie Sachs and other writers. That's a key grappling of 20th century Jewish literature. So now I want to look at literature from the end of the 20th century, just a couple more poems. And part of the challenge in looking at this is that the line between liturgy and poetry becomes somewhat fuzzy, because a lot of these poems we actually use in our congregation as liturgy. We use it to celebrate holidays. So this is one by Marge Piercy called Coming About September. White butterflies with single black finger paint eyes on their wings dart and settle, eddy and mate over the green tangle of vines in Labor Day morning steam. The year grinds into ripeness and rot, grapes darkening, pears yellowing, the first Virginia creeper twinning crimson in the grass, dry straw to burn. So first two stanzas, it's just describing the fall, right? It's not even, at least fall in the Northern Hemisphere, okay? But it's not saying anything Jewish. But now, the new year rises, beckoning across the umbrellas on the sand. I begin to reconsider my life. What is the yield of my impatience? What is the fruit of my resolve? So now she's connecting the harvest of produce to the harvest of deeds, and the turning of the seasons to the turning of the Jewish year. And this concept of cosmic judgment becoming a human self-judgment. I turn from my frantic white dance over the jungle of productivity, and slowly a nigun, a melody, slides cold water down my throat. I rest on a leaf spotted red. Now is the time to let the mind search backward like the raven loose to see what can feed us. Now is the time to cast the mind forward to chart an aerial map of the months. New Year is a great door that stands across the evening, and Yom Kippur is the second door. Between them are song and silence, stone and clay pot to be filled from within myself. I will find there both ripeness and rot, what I have done and undone, what I must let go with the waning days and what I must take in. With the last tomatoes, we harvest the fruit of our lives. So this is a poem about fall, but it's also a meditation on the Jewish New Year and what it means to be in that moment of transition. This one by Primo Levi reflects on creation, but in a scientific way. In the beginning, again, that reference to Genesis. Fellow humans, to whom a year is a long time, a century of venerable goals, struggling for your bread, tired, fretful, tricked, sick, lost, listen, and may it be mockery and consolation. 20 billion years before now, brilliant, soaring in space and time, there was a ball of flame, solitary, eternal, our common father and our executioner. It exploded, and every change began. Even now, the thin echo of this one reverse catastrophe resounds from the farthest reaches. From that one spasm, everything was born. The same abyss that enfolds and challenges us, the same time that spawns and defeats us. Everything anyone has ever thought, the eyes of every woman we have loved, sons by the thousands, and this hand that writes. Now, this is a poem of inspiration. Why do I write? I am the heir to these 20 billion years of cosmic evolution. I might think that, a century is a good run, but, in the context of the universe, it could be not very much. And yet here we are. We love, we write, we do. We are the end product of that chain of events. Now, what makes this a Jewish poem? It has the title In the Beginning, right? Even though it could say the Big Bang, and that would change it a little bit. It's written by a Jewish author, Primo Levi, but maybe it's just Italian poetry. He wrote in Italian. Does what a Jewish writer writes have to be Jewish literature? No, maybe not. So one last one, this one's a little more fun. It's called You Don't Have to Be Jewish. You may remember there was an ad campaign for Levi's Jewish Rye, said you don't have to be Jewish, and it had pictures of Korean people and black people and whatever. Of course, we understand now there are black people and Korean people who are Jewish too. Because Judaism is a peoplehood, and people convert or are adopted or marry someone, or there's all kinds of ways people of different sort of biological backgrounds wind up as part of the Jewish people. But in this period, it was assumed all Jews were white, and so putting non-white people in the commercials was funny. But the poet Roger Kamenetz takes it and makes an interesting meditation on it. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levi's Rye. You can be black, Italian, and Cherokee. You don't have to be Jewish to love, certainly or uncertainly. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levi's Rye, or to love anything. A single caraway seed, or in the rough black seed of the 4 o'clock enclosed in pastel petals late afternoon. You know it's there, and you don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to be Jewish to walk a mile in the park with the sun going down Rosie in the park, or to love Rosie in the park or at home and Rosie loves you back. You don't have to be Jewish to chew slowly, tasting the rye breaking down into sugar. You just have to be willing to slow down time to a poster, a still photograph of you in your ethnic garb in the days when ethnicity was okay, not yet terrifying or indistinct. Kiss me, I'm Irish, and kiss me again, I'm gay, Italian, Chinese, and no parking, this space reserved for Polish. You don't have to be Jewish. You could be anything amazing or distinct. You could have just once, for maybe an hour a day, forgotten you were different. You don't have to be Jewish. You don't have to be to love bread. You don't have to be rye to love Jewish, but it helps. So we use this poem as well as a way to say Jewishness is part of who we are. It's not the only thing of who we are. We can forget that we're Jewish. We can enjoy a black caraway seed or the sun going down Rosie in the park. We can share that human experience with all people. And we can love all people and have them as part of our family. We don't need to make these hard lines. That emphasis, you don't have to be Jewish, you don't have to be Jewish, is an antidote to those saying your marriage partner has to be Jewish, your kids have to be Jewish, you're doing it wrong if you're not doing all Jewish all the time. And his point is, no, we're human beings, and we have human enjoyment too. So again, you see some flavor of how this literature is exploring Jewishness, but in different categories. It's not didactic philosophy, but it's expressing Jewish identity in literary ways. So then the question becomes, could a non-Jew write Jewish literature? Well, do you know who the actress is who plays the marvelous Mrs. Maisel? Her name is Rachel Brosnahan. She's from Highland Park, actually. She's not Jewish, but she's playing a Jewish character. I don't know if the writers are Jewish on the show. I've had people actually review the show and say, this is like Jewish stereotype theater. Like it's uncomfortable how stereotypical they're drawing these characters. Let's just make them loud and rude. That's more like proxy. And it's a complicated question of representation and authenticity. There was a controversy about 20 years ago when they were doing a revival of Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway, and they cast Alfred Molina as Tevye. He's not Jewish, of course, but Tevye is a universal character, right? Can anybody be Tevye? Maybe. Or does it feel like, cultural appropriation? Well, we're in a very different moment now where, having straight people play gay characters or cisgender people play trans characters, that's become somewhat problematic, at least in, the circles of online outrage. And West Side Story, there was a whole question, not only the original version, which had a lot of white actors in brown face, but even the recast version, did it show the ethnic diversity of Latino New York? Or was it just a lot of light-skinned Latinos instead of including some dark-skinned Latinos? So we're getting into these complicated territories, and Jewish literature is one more of those categories where we have to explore, what are the boundaries? What's Jewish about this book? And we don't want to get into the ethnic detective role of saying, well, Bernard Malamud wrote a book about a baseball player who has like a magic bat, and it's like an Excalibur story. And then he's on a baseball team called the Knights. This is The Natural, if you remember either the novel or the Robert Redford movie. The team is called the Knights. It's a Grail story, right? And he's got his Excalibur and he's got his knights that he's on this quest. And okay, fine. Is it a Jewish novel? Well, the author's Jewish, but he's writing in English, and he's writing a retelling of a Christian story from England in a period where there weren't any Jews there. So, does it have to be a Jewish novel if a Jewish author wrote it? Now, Malamud also wrote a book of short stories called The Magic Barrel, which is a wonderful collection of very Jewish short stories. He has one of the stories in that collection is called The First 7 Years, which is about a man who's been working for a tailor for 5 years and wooing his daughter by giving her books to read and writing notes in the margins. And so after having worked for 5 years, he asked for the daughter's hand in marriage, even though he's much older than her. And the tailor says, okay, fine, you can have her after 2 more years. So it's like Jacob having to work for 7 years and having to work for 7 years. So he has, again, some wonderful stories. He has a novel called The Fixer, which is a retelling of the blood libel story that took place in Russia in 1910 or 11 or so. So again, he's written very Jewish novels, but he wrote this one about the Grail story. Does it have to be a Jewish novel just because the author is Jewish? And do you play like ethnic detective to try and suss out what the Jewishness is? Or do you just allow this Jewish author to write an American novel? Maybe they can just write American novels. So that's enough of me on this overview of Jewish literature. I'm curious for your thoughts. If there's a particular novel or short story or poem that you've read that you thought was really moving or interesting, you can just, even if you don't have it handy, just summarize. Or any thoughts on the stuff that we looked at, the specific sources or the general theme of what modern Jewish literature does for people. Yes, Ed, please.
I just finished a book called The Matzah Ball by an author called Jean Meltzer, and it was about a woman from a conservative Jewish background who loves Christmas and wrote romance comedies about it. So I thought it was a very clever book. I don't know if anybody has heard of it, but the Matzah Ball is also a takeoff on a party, a ball type party. So that's something that I thought was very funny, and I recommend it.
Great. There's a wonderful short story by Grace Paley called The Loudest Voice, which is it's a description of the Christmas pageant being put on by a local elementary school, but this is in an area where 90% of the students are Jewish. And they're putting on this pageant. And so the main character of the story is the narrator because she has the loudest voice in school, so she's going to narrate everything. But there's one sort of throwaway line on the side where, it's too bad they gave the O'Hara twins the role of the wise men. They should at least have speaking parts, given that it's their religion. But it's all a nativity story, right? But it's all Jewish people who are cast in these roles in the nativity story. But that's again, the complexity of living as a Jew in Christian America. Well, yes, the characters were Jews, but Jews haven't done that story in a while.
I can't say I've read anything specifically Jewish, so I don't know. Except I did read the entire book on for the class 2 years ago.
Right.
I remember the story about the guy who went into the money.
Yes.
I remember that story. I don't remember the canon.
Oh, I do remember that.
Yeah.
I just forgot where I read it.
Yeah, no, that I remember. I mean, it'd be good to read that again because there was so much stuff in it.
Yeah.
It does. Is there? I mean, what comes to mind is Charlie Chan. The guy who played Charlie Chan was actually white.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that they chose him, his name was Toller, right? Sidney Toller. Was because white people wouldn't accept a real Chinese person as looking Chinese enough for the way they imagined that a Chinese person would look. So I sometimes wonder if some things that Jewish writers write, if it's for a broader audience, if they stereotype it in a way that, you know what I'm trying to say? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Maybe they Jew it up.
Yeah, they Jew it up a little bit, yeah.
Well, yes and no. I mean, remember when Philip Roth wrote Portnoy's Complaint, that got a lot of controversy because it made the Jews look bad.
Yeah.
you know, because he's obsessed with sex and he has this conflict with his mother, and it came out in, I think, 67 or 68, something like that. That was very controversial in the Jewish world. Philip Roth didn't care. He was sort of the, break the mold, and I'm going to do what I want to do kind of personality. And that exemplified to some extent Mailer as well, and Bellow. They weren't interested in what the establishment thought of them necessarily. They were doing it to express their experience, and but their context was Jewish. Bellow grew up in Montreal in a very Jewish community. His earliest novel, The Adventures of Augie March, is about a Jewish protagonist growing up in Chicago, many of the characters, Herzog as well as a Jewish character doing the psychoanalysis and whatever. But it becomes much more of a bourgeois story than a working class story as it would have been in Eastern Europe, because the population reading it is more so. Jewish culture becomes part of American literature. It's one of the genres.
Yeah.
Then once you get enough vocabulary in that people can reference, you don't have to start from scratch every time when you're introducing these things.
Well, think of the number of Borscht Circuit,
Comedians,
and they became very mainstream at some point.
Right. Well, once it went on television.
Yeah, I mean Buddy Hackett, and all these people.
Well, Sid Caesar, and right.
I mean, there's a lot of Jews on TV, and they introduce that kind of culture, into and I didn't realize how. For me, it was very just normal. But my mother, who was from Portland, Oregon, and not Jewish, came into New York, and she was like, "This is a weird place."
Right.
It seemed very odd to her.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, culture shock. Sure.
And how would you categorize someone like Woody Allen, who's raised Jewish, very philosophical? He wrote several books too. And where would you label him? Or someone like, actually, with Mrs. Maisel, I was thinking of Lenny Bruce. He wrote a book, and one of his most famous skits is if Moses and Jesus end up in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. And, they were always talking about, God and a higher being. And
Right, right. So they're grappling with it. I mean, but Woody Allen has a lot of Jewish context for some of his stories. Like he gives the characters very Eastern European Jewish names, and he'll talk about things like a bar mitzvah or some event like that. So he gives it enough Jewish context that that's where he's coming from, and sort of his personality is sort of the New York Jewish nervous psychoanalyst, focused. It's become almost a parody of himself. I think, the challenge with Woody Allen, of course, is what he's done with his life. but the content of what he had to say about Jewishness or about just being human, I think that's part of what he did. Is he, in his best work, I'm thinking, his book Without Feathers or the movie Annie Hall, he's making the Jewish into the human. He's making the Jewish relatable to being human. That's why, Fiddler on the Roof was a worldwide success as a stage show and a movie. It wasn't only Jews attending,
Right.
There was actually a controversy the first year Fiddler was out. They had shows scheduled for Yom Kippur. And some people got very upset at that. Tevye would roll over his grave before he would do. But this isn't Tevye. This is a show. And they do it on Saturdays all the time. It's like, what are you talking about? One of the producers, I think Hal Prince for the show, said, Tevye's made more friends for the Jews than Yom Kippur has.
Well, it introduced there's a certain sort of almost fatalistic philosophy that runs through, I think, because of all the oppression. And it's sort of like, at the end, where it's like, Rabbi, we're waiting for the Messiah. He says, well, we'll have to wait for him somewhere else. But I think that there's a lot of tension, and Tevye is struggling with his third daughter who wants to marry the Christian and move away. That's very universal. There are, I remember I dated an Italian girl when I was in high school, and her father used to call me the kike, behind my back. But he was very opposed to the idea that his daughter, should be dating a guy who wasn't, Catholic,
right.
And they struggle with the same multicultural issues.
That's right. Well, Well, there's a reason why we'll talk about movies in a future class. I was thinking about the jazz singer for two reasons. The original Al Jolson jazz singer. One is exactly that this is a very Jewish story about a cantor's son that they want to sing Kol Nidre, but it had to play in Peoria, and it did because this was an era of millions of immigrants coming in and having the old country versus the new, and America versus tradition, and the same dialogue that Tevye has, where they want to marry for themselves, and then they want to, they're not asking permission, they want to get married without permission, and then marrying outside, and then we have to move, and then, but again, it's a human story that any immigrant family could see themselves in that story, or a descendant of immigrant family, because they're the happy ending. They are what happens after Tevye arrives. In fact, one of the early titles for the musical was "Where Papa Came From." That was one of the ways they had thought about framing it. And again, it came out, I think, remember, the 1960s, so the immigrant generation was the parents of the adults in that period. But the other reason why the jazz singer came to mind was you mentioned that people wanted a Jackie Chan that fits the stereotypes. Well, guess what? Al Jolson at the end of the jazz singer puts on blackface and puts on a wig, so he is, and with big, big white lips around, and to look like the stereotype, because they wouldn't accept a real African American on stage doing it. They accepted the cartoon stereotype, which the Jew is playing. So there's a whole level of, assimilation into what kind of complication there. So we'll talk more about movies in the future, because remember, culture isn't only made in writing. We'll talk next time about music and art, sort of nonverbal expressions, and then we'll look at a separate session about movies, because that really is a relatively new genre. We've had theater, of course, for a long time, but movies is something different, and that's another way of expressing Jewish life. And again, to think, what would make a movie a Jewish movie? I mean, if it was just the producer, okay, that's not going to narrow it down enough for you, right? Or if it was just who are the agents for all the actors, that's not going to narrow it down. Or the studio heads. But if you start thinking about the content, or the story writers, or the context for when the story is being told, maybe that shifts a little bit in terms of what you might include. I mean, obviously you have a Fiddler on the Roof or Annie Hall, where Jewishness is very visibly presented as part of the story. But maybe you have other ones that are more subtle, and yet you can find something that would really pinpoint it as
I
Jewish.
think the Casablanca, for example, is the people who produced it are Jewish, and the actor is clearly not. But there is in the story of the refugees in Casablanca in the movie that smacks very much of that generation of the image of people fleeing from. You can imagine that.
Well, the enemies are Nazis, I think.
Well, yeah, and you can imagine that there's a banker from Amsterdam, and he's saying, like, the second banker was our pastry cook, so we have something to look forward to. Absolutely, to see these people as Jews from Amsterdam,
Getting stuck, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, and I've always thought that Zero Mostel was a very interesting actor, because even as a slave in Rome, he's sort of Jewish. I mean, he is. It's hard. I can't explain why exactly, but I mean, it's.
Well, he came from an Orthodox background, and actually, when he married his wife, who was Irish, I think, his family disowned him totally. And so, at that scene in the musical, he originated Tevye on stage.
I saw it on the. I actually saw it play on stage.
And the scene where the daughter comes to him and says, "Can't you accept us?" And he says, "Never." The actress said it like shook her every time he did it, because he sort of let out all that repressed anger about what his family had done to him, and then he did it to her, and it was really shocking to see that happen. But that was part of his biography, was that story.